especially when it comes to COVID-19 relief, the economic ramifications that we're looking at. But before that, we have to discuss Mr. George Floyd and what has happened in the nation in the last 8 days. Chhaya released a statement. You released a statement saying, "We at Chhaya are outraged by the murder of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and countless others." Starting this interview, could you briefly reflect on that statement? And also, why is it so important for us to have this conversation for our viewers?
Thank you for that question. These are really difficult times for our country. When at the start of this pandemic, we thought, how could we possibly cope? And then now, coupled with that, the horrific murder of George Floyd, I think, which has led to an uprising across the country. We put out that very strong statement yesterday, basically calling on our community, South Asians and Indo-Caribbeans, to really take a deep look at ourselves and our own biases and the roles that we play in promoting, upholding anti-Blackness. We feel very strongly as South Asians, as immigrants, we have a very important role to play in the healing of this country. And as immigrants, we are able to have the opportunities, the freedoms that we enjoy today that has drawn us to this country because of the fight that the Black community has led for decades before we arrived here. And as people of color, our futures, our realities in many respects is very much tied to that of the Black community. And we know that in our community there's deep seated anti-Blackness, and we have to hold ourselves accountable to that and the role that that plays into feeding into the larger ecosystem of racism and discrimination. And we truly believe, and I truly believe, that change really starts at the individual level. It starts in our homes.
I want to talk to you about anti-Blackness. It's a topic that has definitely come up on the forefront in the last 8 days, especially. In terms of making our viewers understand what that is and what the community is exactly doing by participating in it, what do you have to say to that? And also, there are so many grieving right now, not just on the loss of George Floyd, but many, thousands of Black lives that have been lost the same issue. How do we combat this systemic racism, this internalized racism? How do we really understand this?
So as I said at the beginning, I really feel that it starts at the individual level. Every single one of us has a role to play, and none of us have a free pass on this issue. Racism, structural racism exists. It's very real. It excludes Blacks and other people of color and our community members from accessing positions in companies, in organizations. Many of us, when we go to different parts of the country, we feel conspicuous. We feel the racism that's palpable. So we know deeply what the racism is like. However, because of our own internalized oppression and the long history of colonialism that our community has dealt with, we have internalized deep racism that some of us are willing to acknowledge and some of us are not willing to acknowledge. And I firmly believe if we're going to forge a new future where Blacks and other people of color, including us, we all need to play a role and own a piece of that.
Definitely. And I think that's a really strong message sent out by you in terms of understanding what is happening in the community. I would like to get your comments on the protests that we have seen nationwide, especially in New York. We've seen a range of it, from peaceful demonstrations, from candlelight visuals, to stage riots. How do we assess this as a community, and what is your take on protests in general?
Today, I think we're finally acknowledging that the vast majority of the protests that have occurred across the country, including here in New York City, have been peaceful. The news, as news tends to focus on the sort of hotspots, the violence, but the vast majority of the protests have been peaceful, and I would say that the protests are justified. The anger felt by the Black community and communities of colors and other communities is absolutely justified. The horrific murder of George Floyd, I don't know how anybody could watch that and not become personally enraged by that brutality, by the sort of absolute lack of humanity and like that the officer engaged in keeping his knee on a human being and cutting off the air supply for what, 7 minutes or so. I don't know how anybody, if you have a heart, couldn't be enraged by that. So I would say that the protest, the outburst, the anger is absolutely justified, and I think that it's time for change. I think I would just comment on the violence and the looting. I think we know now that much of that is instigated, and it is not the coming from the very well-intentioned protesters. It is instigated, it's stoked, and it's meant to dismiss and the validity of the protest. And I hope that as our community sort of takes in what's happening across the country, that we don't lose sight of what's really important here, that it is time for change. For too long, Blacks and other communities of colors, including immigrants, have been left out of the of freedoms and opportunities that whites have enjoyed in this country. And this country is our country too.
In your statement on this incident, you called upon certain changes, and you also reflected upon the actions we could take as a community, especially South Asians and Indo-Caribbeans. I would like for you to share that.
We shared 3 actions: a petition and other actions. I think but we really want to emphasize that for everyone, not everybody's going to be able to donate to causes that are leading the charge in drawing attention to the systemic racism and long injustices that Blacks have felt in this country. But what we really want to leave our community with is that check yourself, check your family members. Let's hold each other accountable to how we promote anti-Blackness in this country. And even if you don't really, you're not there yet where you can feel the empathy, but it does actually come right back to us as a community. We are also, in many respects and in many spaces, considered outsiders, not welcomed, and experience immense racism.
Definitely. Right now, I'd like to talk to you about COVID-19, because we cannot forget that we are in a pandemic while the country is outraged right now. There are a lot of issues that Chhaya is strongly fighting for, especially in order to relieve the economic ramifications as well as the healthcare impact of COVID-19. I'd like to reflect upon the issues of housing policy amidst COVID-19. Could you reflect on what exactly are you fighting for and what is needed in terms of these economic ramifications when we're looking at housing or we're looking at taxes?
It's important for us to first start by acknowledging that COVID-19 has disproportionately impacted people of color in New York City and across the country. And the community that's been most impacted have been Blacks. If we look at the community that Chhaya cares about, which is low to moderate income South Asians and Indo-Caribbeans, that community has also been deeply, deeply impacted. And as many have already stated, there are preconditions that determine how the disease has played out in various communities, starting with poverty, and the kinds of jobs we have, and the health conditions that are pre-existing. Many of our community members are essential workers. Many have jobs that didn't allow them to go to work remotely early on. Many worked until the absolute last hour that they could, because they knew that if they stopped working, their income would stop. And so all of those things caused high infection rates. I also should mention that the housing conditions also added to the sort of complication and the high infection rates, where many members of our community live in extremely overcrowded homes. And so if one member of the family has or household member has the disease, it's surely going to, cause infections in the entire family. There's not really space for somebody who's living in an overcrowded home to isolate, to quarantine.
Right.
And so that is a complicating factor. So now let's talk about the economic impact. As I mentioned, many of our community members work in jobs that don't have protections, don't have protections and allow them the ability to take their work remote. And so they are now finding themselves without a source of income, and they haven't had income for months now. And many of them, additionally, do not qualify for the federal stimulus funds that went out to individuals. And many do not also qualify for unemployment, and that could be for a range of reasons, right? That they are not working formally on the books, they may be undocumented, etc. Or many may not have filed taxes and therefore did not also qualify for the stimulus package funds. So today, with all of that said, our community is in absolute strife. Rent has been due 3 times since the shutdown. Many people cannot pay their rent. Our community members are facing tremendous food insecurity. Chhaya, just a couple of weeks ago, distributed 700 bags of food to 700 individuals. And it was just one weekend, and we know, and just given the response rate that we had, it's quite telling of how deep and widespread that need is.
Yes.
And then, of course, so we've talked about renters and the fact that folks are unable to pay rent. We've talked about the food insecurity issues, but of course there are folks who own their homes, and that doesn't mean that they're okay necessarily, right? If you've lost your job, and we know that we're facing record high unemployment. So even if you were, in a more stable employment situation, but you've lost your job, and now your mortgage is due and has been due for months now, and you may have taken advantage of the mortgage forbearance program, but little did you know that you're going to have a balloon payment in a few months. And so we're very much concerned about that. And then, of course, there's the small business piece to all of this. Many members, we've estimated about 30% of our community is employed by small businesses, and small businesses, restaurants, small retail shops, have been devastated. Many of them have been shut down and cannot see how they could reopen. And so this is also having a rippling effect in terms of the economic conditions that our community is now facing.
What is needed in terms on the government level? Because we're talking here about changes that have to happen in the government. We're talking about relief that has to come from way beyond than just the community. What is needed, and are you happy with the leadership of the local officials and the state government?
what what our community is needed. So there've been a great deal of philanthropic responses, community-based responses with regard to food, with regard to cash assistance.
Right.
Chhaya has already distributed cash to over 200 individuals, and we are expecting to distribute cash to another 700. All of that have been have to some degree stopped the bleeding temporarily. What is needed is more broad-based solution that go beyond just the stopping the bleeding, that really takes a long-term or even or medium-term view. So take renters, for example. A sort of one-off payment is not going to help somebody be able to stay in their home if there's no job inside. They've lost their jobs and they have no way. The economy is going to take maybe another year or two before it can come back, and many of those jobs can come back online. So for renters, we are calling for a massive rent relief. The governor has in place an eviction moratorium, which has extended to August. But that's just sort of a temporary measure as well. But what's really needed is a comprehensive package that supports, pays for the rent of people who can't pay rent. And it's critical, because if we don't do that, we will face mass homelessness in the city. We already have a homelessness problem and we had a housing crisis before COVID. And so let's talk about the landlord side of this. So if individuals stop paying their rent, there's a loss somewhere, and that loss will be on the shoulders of the landlords. And many of the landlords, I would say the majority of the landlords of the city are good landlords, or many are small landlords who rely, and many are immigrant landlords who rely on rent to upkeep their buildings, to pay taxes, to pay water bills, etc. And their own personal income, and they are not necessarily wealthy. That is their source of income. So we are also calling for relief for small landlords. And then I mentioned the mortgage issue. So Chhaya has developed a policy platform called Secure Our Homes. And if you go to our website, you'll see more details about that. But what we are asking for is a more comprehensive program starting from the federal government, going down to the state government, that really looks at this matter holistically and keeps the real estate industry stable, keeps people in their homes, whether they're renters or homeowners. Because if we don't, we are looking at destabilizing the entire real estate industry, which will take us back to the 70s and 80s of New York City. We're already seeing, a flight of the sort of more wealthy, upper middle class folks from the city, because they have choices. But the vast majority of the people we care about don't have those choices. This is their home, and we have to find a way to make sure that they stay in their homes.
Annetta, as the executive director of Chhaya, what is your, focus or some important factors for you for the next coming weeks? What do you have to consider and fight for, which is very important, so that everyone that is being helped by Chhaya continues to be helped and has food, shelter, and access to healthcare?
We provide a great number of services to our community, from housing counseling, helping tenants really understand their rights in this time, to support to homeowners to help them really understand the mortgage forbearance program and to not get themselves in trouble, to individuals, helping them file for unemployment, advocating on their behalf on all of these areas, and more. Our direct service work to the community will continue and will ramp up. In fact, as I mentioned previously, we are now addressing food insecurity needs as well as basic cash needs. We recognize, though, that is a small community-based organization, that there's only so much we can do, and the need is tremendous. Really, but we as an organization that has tremendous insight into how this is all playing out in the lives of individuals, we have a responsibility to use that information to advocate for broader policy fixes, policy responses, policy changes. And so I've been spending most of my time advocating for solutions from the city, state, and federal government. I have been appointed to the mayor's recovery task force looking at the social service sector, and I've been advocating in that space very hard for the stabilization of organizations, small immigrant-based organizations like Chhaya, because organizations like Chhaya are also threatened in terms of our ability to remain in business in this time, given the expected cuts from city funding as well as from private philanthropy. And so for us, we see that it is absolutely critical for us to focus our energies on advocating for policy solutions and government responses, because there's only so much we can do as individuals and as community-based organizations.
Annetta, this was so great having you here on ITV Gold with us. I truly appreciate you for your time. Just while we're ending this interview, I'd love for you to give our community perhaps some information on how they can get involved, how to truly be a part of a grassroots organization like Chhaya, and just a message out to all of the South Asian Americans, Indo-Caribbeans just watching you on ITV Gold.
A few things. In this time, none of us can afford to sit back and watch this and watch our city and watch our communities and our own lives fall apart. There's something that each of us can do. I'm going to start with the census. It's critical that every one of us complete the census. The census response rate in our communities remain amongst the lowest citywide and nationally. If people don't know that we're here, we don't matter. Our communities will never get the funding that it needs. And we're seeing that in this crisis. So complete the census, please. Second, if you are able to vote, vote. Please vote. That is the one action that you can take that could change things. And by voting, again, you send the message that I am here, I matter. It doesn't matter who you vote for, but vote. And then politicians start to pay attention to our community's needs. Additionally, we talked about systemic racism. Each of us have a responsibility to change our culture, change the way we think, and really think and really think of our collective humanity. As South Asians and Indo-Caribbeans, we have had a long history, and we've bought into the divisions that others have sold us. And it's time for us to push back on that and really think of ourselves as part of a greater collective of this American landscape. And then I'm going to just say, check out the Chhaya website and follow us on social media. Follow the campaigns that we are involved in. Our campaigns, our petitions are only more effective if you support. And it doesn't matter where you sit, whether you're undocumented, documented, you speak English, you don't. There are ways that you can have your voice heard. And if you don't speak English, our staff speaks 7 different languages. So we are here to interpret and translate for you. And then absolute lastly, if you have the ability to give, it's really important that you support organizations like Chhaya in this time, because we're only able to do the work that we do if we can stay in business. And as I said, our existence is also threatened by this economic downturn.